All right, so as always, we begin with our land acknowledgement, and we acknowledge that our campus at King's University College is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinungtong peoples, all of whom have long-standing relationships to the land of southwestern Ontario and the City of London. The First Nations communities of our local area include Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Munsee Delaware Nation. In our region, there are 11 First Nations communities, as well as a growing Indigenous urban population. King's University College values the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and of all the original peoples of Turtle Island, also known as North America. Tonight, I would just invite each of us to consider how we are in relationship with the land that sustains us, with our neighbors who share in that relationship, and how we care for each other. Long-standing treaties guide us, and they call forth a response that seeks justice and peace for all. So I'm very pleased to welcome this mighty but small group. So we've got 27 people online, but welcome to our final Veritas lecture for this year. My name is Jim Pancho. For those of you I don't know, I'm the director, no, I know, but I don't know all of you, but I'm the director of campus ministry here at King's University at Western. It's my privilege to coordinate this lecture series, and the series engages speakers from a variety of backgrounds to explore the depth of human experience and to articulate the truth, the fullness of humanity to which we all aspire. The Catholic intellectual tradition welcomes and embraces this exploration as a participation in the common good that enhances the world that we inhabit. And our theme this year is Seeds of Hope. It acknowledges that new life and opportunity often follows on times of adversity. By trusting in the wisdom that lies embedded within the community, we can collectively find a way forward into a future full of hope. So as I mentioned, we're limited in this webinar format in terms of the way we can interact with each other. And I do look forward, as I'm sure with all of you, look forward to a time when we'll be able to gather together in a personal way in community. But for now, I'd like you to just take note of the Q&A button on your screen. And you're welcome to pose and enter questions at any time during the lecture. My job will then be to gather and pose those questions to our speaker on your behalf. As well, I'll try to monitor the chat as the lecture unfolds. So if there's anything that we need to address right away, we will try to do that as well. All right, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. Christian Harvey is the executive director of One City Peterborough. It's an organization that is passionate about creating a community where everyone has a chance to flourish, in particular, those who have experienced homelessness and criminalization. And this is done by creating housing, employment, and support opportunities. Christian studied theology at the University of Toronto and Tyndale University, and is an ordained deacon with the Anglican Diocese of Toronto. Christian is passionate about people, community development, music, and cycling. He loves Peterborough and lives there with his family. I have to say, I'm happy to welcome another deacon and also someone who happens to love music. So please join me tonight in welcoming Christian to speak on the topic, criminalizing others for our comfort, confronting our systemic exclusion of those experiencing homelessness and marginalization. I will turn it over to Christian.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's really great to be here and to be at King's College. Well, not at King's College, but virtually with you today and to speak about this that I'm really passionate about. So when I was a kid, what I wanted most was a place to belong. I was an awkward kid, and as much as I tried, being cool, being accepted, being in the in crowd was just always out of reach. Every attempt seemed to fail. I tried sports, which was the easiest way for acceptance in my small town. But on my team, rather than being the most valuable player, I always got the most improved player, which was that award that they give the kid who was never that great, but they wanted to make sure still paid their registration fee the following year. I tried clothes, but they were so expensive. And when in the 90s, when everyone was wearing those super cool No Fear t-shirts, I was wearing the byway knockoff No Mercy. I remember getting my first pair of Doc Marten shoes, which again, in the early 90s, that's what all the cool kids were wearing. I was so pumped. I remember buying them at this store in Toronto that said 100% or like 98% off everything. And I was so excited. My mom bought me these shoes and I wore them to school the first day. And I was like, this is my in. You know, wearing these, girls are going to love me. Boys are going to ask me to hang out. This is my step. And then all of a sudden, with disgust, my classmate Dana White said, you know, those are ripoffs, right? I was like, no, there aren't. They say Doc Marten right on the sole. And she pointed out to me, Christian, if they were real, they would say Dr. Marten. Doc Marten's the nickname. And I just remember being so devastated. I was so close and yet again, so far away. Again and again, I tried to be on the inside. I tried to wear the right clothes, do the right things, but belonging always seemed just out of reach. That wasn't until high school, and I figured out my way in. See, in the 90s, grunge became a thing, which meant dressing cool had never been so cheap. I just had to go to the local thrift store, and I could look cool. Puberty thinned me out a little bit. I learned to play drums. I joined some bands, and all of a sudden, I was in, and I loved it. And once you're on the inside, you don't really question it anymore. You don't question the binary of who's in and who's out. I mean, I knew that there were still kids on the outside, kids who know no matter how hard they tried, that follow the ever-changing rules and regulations of belonging, that they just couldn't do it. But once it wasn't me anymore, I just didn't ask a lot of questions. But sometimes you couldn't ignore it. And I remember so clearly in gym class, there was this kid named Kevin. And Kevin was awkward on all levels. He just didn't fit in. He was clumsy. He was a bit awkward looking. He wasn't great at thinking on his feet. He didn't do well in school. He didn't do well in sports. And really the only thing that he could do was run. And so at the beginning of gym class every day, he would get out on the track and just book it. He would run as hard as he could. Now this violated the number one rule of cool, which is to never look like you're trying. But on the track, my classmates would laugh at his running. They would try and trip him up when he ran by. They'd yell out names at him. Regrettably, Forrest Gump had just come out, so obviously people are yelling, "Run, Forrest, run." And yeah, it was uncomfortable. Yeah, I empathized with him. I didn't want to see this, but I was finally on the inside, and I wasn't going to do anything that would leave me out. So basically, I just remained silent. And I eased my conscience by saying, well, at least I didn't join in. I wasn't the one trying to trip him up. I wasn't the one calling him names. I just sat there silently. Years later, I bumped into Kevin, and he was working at a grocery store. We began to chat, and out of nowhere, he said to me, you know what, Christian? You were one of the only kids who was nice to me in high school. And I know he meant it as a compliment, but I felt horrible because Kevin's whole high school experience of kindness was this kid who just ignored him. I was what he saw as being nice, and all I did was not acknowledge him. This messed with my head quite a bit. And as a result, creating inclusive communities became sort of a mission of mine. I started working at the Anglican Church when I was about 23 years old, and I pursued making space wherever I could, where everyone belonged. I started youth programming for quote unquote at-risk kids. We started meal programs. We opened a shelter for individuals who couldn't use the shelter system. We started a drop-in center in the basement of the church that served lunch and dinner every day to people. And I was feeling so good about what we had achieved. We'd done it. We created a place where everyone belonged. And one day I was preaching, I was preaching at our Sunday morning service, and on that particular day, the scripture was James 2. And you might know this scripture, and I'll read it to you now. My brothers and sisters, do you, with your acts of favoritism, really believe in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ? For if a person with gold rings and in fine clothes comes into your assembly, and if a poor person in dirty clothes also comes in, and if you take notice of the one wearing the fine clothes and say, have a seat here, please, while to the one who is poor you say, stand there or sit at my feet, have you not made distinctions among yourself and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers and sisters, has not God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom that he has promised those who love him? But you've dishonored the poor. Is not the rich who oppress? Is it not the rich who oppress you? Is it not they who drag you into court? Is it not they who blaspheme the excellent name that is invoked over you? Now, let's be honest, I find that this scripture preaches itself. It didn't really need me to say anything because I feel like this scripture, every time we read it in church, challenges us. But on that day, I was feeling like I was on fire. I was feeling like I was just preaching up a storm. I felt like the crowd was, the congregation was with me. I was in the zone. And I began to say with like great gusto, in these walls, we do not recognize class. In these walls, you're not treated better if you're rich or worse if you're poor. In these walls, we are all one. Now, sitting in the congregation that day was a guy named Ben. I'd known Ben for quite a while. Ben had grown up in Peterborough, but left for quite a lot of his life and had just come back in the last couple of years. He was in his 60s and lived much of his adult life on the streets. Ben loved the church, but the church was also a place where he had suffered abuse as a child, so he always had mixed feelings when he was at church. And he started worshiping with us when he started staying at our shelter. He was one of the few people who crossed the great chasm between those being served downstairs and those worshiping upstairs. Now, that day, he was listening intently to everything I had to say. And after my proclamation of what was happening in these walls, he stood up and boldly proclaimed, Christian, you know that's bullshit. You know that when I come in here, people are staring at me the whole time. You know that people are uncomfortable as soon as I walk in the room. They watch me as the offering plate goes by and are waiting for me to do something crazy. And he stormed out of the church. Now, though I'm Anglican, I grew up Pentecostal. So I knew a word of prophecy when I hear it. So all I could say at that moment was, thus saith the Lord, and sat down. Because regrettably, I knew that Ben was right. The church, though offering him some semblance of shelter and some food, was not a place where he was fully welcome and treated as an equal. As a straight, white, middle-class man with a family, I have never known what it is to walk into a church and know that my very presence makes people uncomfortable, that people feel an instant feeling of distrust towards me. I'm exactly who churches want. I'm who they're targeting. But when Ben walks into the door, his presence immediately makes people feel anxious, and he knows that. They're worried that he's going to do something that's going to make them uncomfortable. They instantly see him as danger before he's done anything. They already, and often the church is worried that his very presence is going to make people like me and my family uncomfortable, and that maybe we won't come back. But the church is just the very beginning, because really that happens wherever Ben goes. He'll always be viewed the same way, with suspicion, with fear, and often with contempt. Ben will receive message after message throughout his day that will tell him that he's not welcome in our community. And just like that, I had in my mind that we were that before this, I thought we were the most welcoming church going. And this is also what our cities often feel. We tell stories and use language that make us feel justified, feeling like we're still good people, but that it's okay for us to exclude Ben. We'll label Ben in different ways. We'll label him dangerous. We'll label Ben lazy. We'll label Ben a drain on our society. We'll label Ben sick. We'll put all these labels on him, all of which are to make sure that the blame for his exclusion is put squarely on his shoulders and that we can wipe our hands of it. You see, I often speak to groups about homelessness, and we'll often ask, why does homelessness exist? Actually, this is the question, and because we're mean, we always ask whenever we're interviewing potential new staff at One City Peterborough. Why does homelessness exist? And immediately when we ask, people freeze. And why I ask it is that I'm interested in who we blame for homelessness. Because who we blame will have a direct impact on how we look to address it. And most of the time, most of us put the blame of homelessness on the individual. It's a result of their addiction. It's a result of their bad decisions. These are the things that cause homelessness. And so the sickness that is homelessness is in the person in themselves. And to heal homelessness, we need to heal the individual. But until they're healed, we have to keep our community safe from them. So we need to discourage any antisocial behavior they have. This is how it's often treated, that we put the blame of homelessness on the individuals experiencing it. And then because of that, we can justify our exclusion. Ben and those experiencing homelessness, those living in poverty, those with experiences with the legal system, they are clearly the other. They are outside. They are what I was for most of elementary school, but on a societal scale. If community is X, they are the non-X. We have common ways in which, and we have common ways to deal with that non-X, that out person in our midst. When the person who doesn't belong comes into our midst, we have various ways of sorting it, of dealing with them. Miroslav Volf, in his book, Exclusion and Embrace, names 4 ways that we treat, of how we treat the other in our midst. He says, either we demand their assimilation, or we dominate them, or we abandon them, or we expel or eliminate them. Well, first is assimilation. As I named earlier, not only churches, but our society is built by people like me, for people like me. Laws are made to protect me. Schools are made to educate me. Banks are made to support me. The system is built for me. Now, that doesn't mean that the Bens of this world aren't invited to join. It just means that they need to become like me in order to do so. Assimilation is your way in. Once you assimilate, the world is yours, or at least this is the promise. And this makes sense if we believe that homelessness is the fault of those experiencing homelessness. If we believe that the reason they are homeless is because they're making bad choices, the answer then is to develop programs that teach them how to make better choices so that they can better assimilate into current society. Current society is obviously the right way, and we just need to teach people how to make better decisions so they can become a part of it. We have various programs like that. One such program would be like Bridges Out of Poverty. And Bridges is a framework for understanding poverty and the hidden rules of economic class. It was developed by Ruby Payne. Now, let me say first, I know many people have found Bridges a really meaningful experience, and there have been positive outcomes from this framework. But I do see at its core this idea of what we're looking to do is assimilate people into middle-class culture. We're teaching, it teaches that what they talk about is teaching the hidden rules of poverty and middle-class culture so that we can learn that and people can therefore make better choices or can choose to follow which rules they want. But that is kind of the definition of assimilation, is that it's saying these are the rules of us, and are you going to follow them? Are you going to become like us? And I think this is a huge problem, that we are constantly demanding the assimilation of those in our communities who are experiencing homelessness. We're telling them they need to get a job, to climb the ladder, become a taxpayer, get your own unit, don't rely on a government or any support, become independent. And then you can be part of us, you can be in. Well, maybe, because my experience is that most people who have experienced homelessness or criminalization, even if they're trying so hard, just as I did as a child, to be in, will never quite fit. Assimilation is also behind the many rules and laws that we put into place, because so many of the narratives around homelessness is that individuals are responsible for their own homelessness, and so because they make the bad choices. And so we need to de-incentivize making those choices. We need to de-incentivize homelessness. Now listen to how this sounds. We as a system have convinced ourselves that the blame of homelessness is on the individual. And we've begun to put into place structures, because we believe that, we put into place structures that de-incentivize homelessness. We for years ran a shelter. The shelter was literally the basement of a church where every night at 9 p.m. we would set up cots, and every morning at 9 a.m. we would tear them down. If you were staying at our shelter, you were sleeping in cots with 40 other people in a room, no access to shelters. You had to be out of there all day. And you know what the major concern the system had? That the place was too nice and that we didn't motivate people to get out of homelessness. This was in a community with a less than 2% rental vacancy rate. Shelters also often will put into place policies around that if someone is not searching for housing, they will be evicted. Bylaws are put into place, and we'll speak more about this later, that ban encampments in public spaces and are often justified by saying we don't want to encourage people to be homeless. Become like us and you can be included. This is the message. But just as no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't be included during elementary school, there are those who will never fit our version of good citizen. So what do we do with them? Those who refuse or are unable to assimilate, what do we do? Well, this is where domination comes into play. You see, a small number of outsiders is useful in our community. They have a role to play in either increasing our wealth or just inflating our egos. We don't want them to live too close to us, worship with us, or be in equal position with us. But a certain amount of individuals in that place can be helpful. Charity is one of the major ways that domination comes to life. And I say this as someone who has been the executive director of a couple nonprofit charitable organizations. So this is not to say that all charity is bad, but I think we always have to be aware of what charity can lead to. I want to believe I'm a good person. And yet often when I see people sitting on the streets, asking for change, when I see people tenting, I feel bad about the inequality that exists in my community. I look at what I have and I look at what they have and I know something's wrong, but I don't want it to be that I'm not a good person. So what do I do with this guilty feeling? Well, we need, as writer Janet Poppendick says in her book, Sweet Charity, we need a guilt release valve, something that lets us feel like we're good people again. So I might volunteer at a soup kitchen, or I might donate funds somewhere. And none of these are bad in and of themselves, but we need to meet people's needs. But what happens is that we often do these things to release our guilt without going deeper into the issue themselves. And at the same time, when we need to feel better. So we were running a drop-in center for a lot of years. And we would feed people. And one of the biggest complaints we would receive from our volunteers was that those that they were feeding weren't grateful enough. And we'd wrestle with that. Why did that make them feel so bad that people weren't grateful enough for them? And what we began to realize is that often, again, because we want to do this release valve piece, we're engaging in this charitable work to do this release valve piece, that when people weren't grateful, it wasn't giving that valve, that release that they needed. What we talked about is that we believed as an organization that food was a human right. And people, though living in gratitude is always a beautiful thing for all of us to do, people don't need to thank us for meeting what they should have as a basic human right. But for many individuals, that was a really hard thing because they needed to give in charity to make them feel better about themselves. Another example of this was there was an individual in our community who, a much loved man who panhandled for a lot of his life. And he passed away this year. And when he passed away, there was memorials made for him. It was all over social media. And it was a big deal for people. And that was beautiful in a lot of ways because this man who had been seen as just a panhandler was beloved by the community. But those of us who worked with a lot of individuals who panhandle also saw something. The reason why this man in particular was loved is because he played the role that the community wanted him to play. You see, those who engage in panhandling are expected to play a role. They're supposed to be just contrite enough, so hold themselves low like this. They need to be saying thank you all the time. They need to be incredibly polite. They need to not have too nice a clothing, but not look so destitute that it makes people too uncomfortable. There's a role that, and you speak to panhandlers, and they'll tell you this, there is a role that they're expected to play. It doesn't matter if they got a really nice jacket and didn't pay anything for it, that they got it, because we give out, as an organization, we give out jackets all the time, often really nice ones. But people are engaged in panhandling, those jackets are of no use to them, because if they're wearing nice jackets, people get angry at them. Because again, they're not playing the role that we need them to play. We dominate through this. We want to use those who are the outside to make us feel better about ourselves. Similarly, we dominate through scapegoating. We need people to blame for what is going wrong in our communities. Quite a few years ago, I was lecturing at Trent University in the business school on homelessness. I don't know why the business school invited me to lecture on homelessness, but it was fun. And I decided that day that I was going to bring my friend who was living homeless behind the business school, or I don't know if they have a whole school, but behind where the classroom was, because I thought, well, he knows what homelessness is. And so my friend Eric, I went and said, hey, you want to do a lecture with me? He's like, yeah, I do. He's like, first off, I love speaking to groups of people. Second off, I keep sneaking in to use that washroom so I actually can use it without getting into trouble. So this is great. So anyway, we went in and we went into the building, and I went into the classroom first. He said, I'm just going to go use the washroom. So I went in, and the organizers greeted me and started saying, hey, Christian, thanks so much for coming. We're so happy to have you here. And we were catching up. And then my friend Eric walked in after me, and I could see, they were looking at the door, but I could tell he walked in because I could see their faces, and their faces dropped, and they started whispering. They're like, what should we do? Do we need to call security? What do we need to do about this? And so I turned around and I saw that it was Eric coming in, and I said, actually, he's the other guest lecturer. Well, they were not prepared for that. And they're like, oh, okay, cool, thanks, that's great. So anyway, we got going, and I began to give my really great, my lecture that made them, that had funny anecdotes and used numbers and all these sorts of things, all the things they were expecting from a nice church guy giving a lecture on homelessness. And then I said, and now I'd like to invite my friend Eric to give a lecture, because he knows homelessness in a way that I never will. And so he's going to speak to you about what homelessness looks like in Peterborough. And Eric stood up and got him down, and I sat down, and I had no idea what he was going to say. Eric said, I'm pissed at all you Trent students. And I was like, oh, I do not know where this is going. He's like, we get blamed for all the stuff that you guys do. We get blamed for everything. Every time something happens downtown by you drunk Trent students, we get blamed. People talk about the need to clean up the downtown of all the panhandlers and homeless people. He's like, every time a bottle gets thrown through a window, we get the blame. But whenever that happens, I go and look, and it's never a buck of beer. It's never one of these cheap beers. It's always your expensive foreign beers that are thrown through those windows. Once it's these cheap beers, you can start blaming us. But as long as it's that expensive stuff, we know it's you Trent students. And there's silence in the room, because they knew he was right. That whenever something happens, it is always the blame of those who are marginalized. When Tent City emerged, and I'll speak about that a little bit more later, but when Tent City emerged, for the whole time that it was in existence, whenever there was any act of violence in the downtown, it was always Tent City was referenced. So in the paper, it would say there was a fight in downtown Peterborough, happened 4 blocks away from Tent City. Now, if you know Peterborough, you know that everything's 4 blocks away from Tent City. Tent City was in the middle of downtown. There is nothing that everything is 4 blocks away from Tent City. right? And this is the thing, is that by constantly referencing that, it was all violence, all vandalism, everything could be blamed on those who are marginalized. We need those who are marginalized, those who are experiencing homelessness, to scapegoat so much of what's happening in our community. We once ran an event, there was quite a few years ago, there was a municipal election going on, and many of the individuals who were running on the platform of cleaning up the downtown. And you know that when people say cleaning up the downtown, they're not saying because the streets are dirty. What they're talking about is people who are down there. They're talking about people as if they're garbage. And so we decided we were going to do something about that. We decided as a church, we're going to do an event called "How Would Jesus Clean Up the Downtown?" And we invited all the people who were running, and they had to come. And we invited a bunch of people from many of the local churches. And then we invited people to give lectures who were experiencing homelessness, or who engage in panhandling, to talk about what it feels like to be spoken of as if they're garbage. Because again, they were being blamed for why the downtown was going downhill. They were being blamed for that. And they wanted to say, we are not garbage. And what was cool is that after that, none of the people, though they said it in roundabout ways, no one used the language of cleaning up the downtown anymore. Because we exposed what they were actually doing. But there is those who maybe we don't dominate. And that's when we move to abandonment. So often we will abandon people to what's going on. So that is what we see when we see people exiting to the suburbs, avoiding the places in town that have people from different economic backgrounds. That makes people uncomfortable, and so they avoid those areas. We create areas that are ghettoized and only have people of one economic background because we're uncomfortable seeing anything that's different than ourselves. So we abandon, we leave, we label areas unsafe, unsalvageable, and we make sure we never go there. Or we do things like what happened at the beginning of the pandemic in many communities, is that when we began to put into place public safety measures, those safety measures took away much of what those who were experiencing homelessness needed to survive. In Peterborough, what happened is at the beginning of the pandemic, all public washrooms were closed for safety measures. All access to water was closed for safety measures. And for most of us, that didn't matter because we were staying in our homes. But for those experiencing homelessness, what were they supposed to do? They had nowhere to go. They had nowhere to use the washroom, and to go to the washroom in public was a crime. What were they to do? And so we abandoned people. We closed down most of the services they accessed, which again, for many of us, that meant working from home. For them, that meant they had nothing. They had nowhere to go. And finally, we engage in expulsion. For those that won't assimilate, for those that won't be dominated, for those who won't stay where we've abandoned them, those are the ones that we look to expel from our midst. But we'll do it in ways that don't make us look so bad. One of those ways is just by the architecture that we use. And I'm going to share my screen so that you can see what this looks like. Because we don't often think about the architecture we use as a way in which we tell people you're not welcome in our community. So let me show you some pictures. These are from various communities. So you can see these pictures. Now, again, these look artistic. These look like beautiful, they look like, hey, let's make this great, something beautiful. But in reality, why this is put there is not because there was a great call out for beautiful greats in the community. What there was people would sleep there. That is a warm spot to sleep. And we need to make sure they don't. Similarly, rock gardens under bridges. This is commonly used because under a bridge is where, if you have nowhere else to sleep, that's where you can sleep. Also, benches with armrests in the middle. I don't know that many of us have been sitting on a bench and saying the thing that makes this bench uncomfortable is the lack of armrest. Benches are uncomfortable anyway. The armrest usually isn't the issue. These armrests are put there so that you can't sleep there, so that you can't lie there. Here's some more. Now, this isn't even trying to hide it, but this is popping up in more and more communities, is the spike in different areas, in alcoves that might be a good place to sleep. Here again, I mean, the really ironic thing is that this is at the station called Inclusion, but again, you see spikes in a place where someone might be able to sit or sleep. And here, a bench that is slanted. Again, these things are built in ways to let someone know that they're not welcome here. It's always fascinating when I speak to individuals who are experiencing homelessness, for them to share their experience. When we begin to talk about hostile architecture, for them to begin to share some examples that they've seen. And they're often things I would never have thought of. I wouldn't have even noticed, but the way in which we design places so that others so that they don't have access to them. We create these hostile architecture places, and we also create laws and rules that let people know that they are not welcome. Often this is happening through bylaws in majority of time in our communities. So it might not be provincial laws, but it's these bylaws that are passed, and often quietly. So let me share the example of Peterborough. So Peterborough, Peterborough for years and years and years, like many communities, had been kind of sweeping homelessness under the rug for a long time. But eventually, like in most communities now, we began to find that there's no more rug to sweep it under anymore. There's nowhere else that we can hide it. And it erupted into a tent city in the summer of 2019. Now, the interesting thing was there was no tent city on June 30th, but on July 1st, all of a sudden a tent city emerged. And the community began to realize there is a homelessness problem in our community. Now, nothing really changed between those 2 days, right? The homelessness issue wasn't worse on the 1st than it was on the 30th. It was just an encampment that people couldn't ignore, was erected in the middle of a main park in downtown Peterborough. And this tent city, basically people were saying, we literally have nowhere else to go. We don't have anything, and we are sick of being hidden. We are going to be seen, and we are going to be heard. I remember going to the council meetings where individuals who were staying in that tent city would go and say, where do you want us to go? Because there was these constant calls to evict, to get rid of this tent city, and people longingly were screaming at council saying, we don't have anywhere to go. Where do you want us to go? And there was silence. Finally, the city decided they were going to pass a bylaw. And that bylaw made tenting and sleeping overnight in parks illegal. And you could be fined up to $10,000 for sleeping in a park or erecting a tent. And I should say they didn't make it illegal. They made it that you had to apply for a permit in order to have a tent. Now, we then inquired, could we get a permit? And they said, no, it is impossible to get a permit. What is very easy is that you can go on the Peterborough City website and find how to report an illegal tent, but to actually apply for a permit was impossible. And so it was made illegal. Now, at the beginning, the mayor said, though we've got this bylaw, we aren't going to use it. But within the next 30 days, a notice was posted, and people were evicted from their from the encampment. Now, the really depressing thing was that once the encampment was dispersed, and didn't mean anyone went anywhere, it just meant they had to hide again. The call to address homelessness reduced a huge amount. You see, the thing wasn't that there was people experiencing homelessness that was making people uncomfortable. It was the fact that they could be seen. And what we know now is that people who are experiencing homelessness have it worse than they've ever had it before. That people are constantly hiding. We, as an organization, One City Peterborough, have outreach workers who support individuals who are living outside. We hand out survival gear such as tents. But when we hand out tents, we almost always know those tents are going to be confiscated by city workers, because as soon as a tent is complained about, then city staff will come and remove those belongings and often just throw them into the dump. And so people's mental health is worse than it's ever been. People literally have nowhere to go. And this is an interesting thing that we see throughout Ontario, not just in Peterborough, is that you cannot stay in a shelter if you're from a different community. But say in communities like our own, where shelter evictions have increased by 300% in the last year, you've got a whole lot of people who aren't allowed to access shelter. And yet most communities have rules that say you can't access shelter if you aren't from that community. So if someone's evicted from all the shelters in Peterborough and then leave to another community that has that rule, they also aren't allowed to access shelters in that community. So there's no point in even going. But then the reality is that they're not allowed to sleep in any public parks. They're not allowed to sleep in obviously alleyways. They're not allowed to sleep in bank vestibules. They're not allowed to sleep in parking garages. They literally have no place where they can legally survive. So we expel them from our midst, but in reality, people can't just disappear. They have to live, but we've made it so that they have no legal options to do so. Their very existence is a crime. And so these ways in which we deal with people of saying, we're going to expel you from our midst, are so destructive. So how can we create an alternative to this? How can we begin to address this in a different way? Well, I like to use the analogy of, and this is not new, this is not something I created, and many of you have probably heard it, but the story of the river, the kind of parable of a river, right? And that parable goes, say we're all hanging out at the bottom of a river, now beside a fast rushing river, and we're having a picnic, having a lot of fun, and we hear someone crying out from the river, and they're saying, help, help, help. And we run to the river, and together we're able to pull them out, and we're able to care for them and pull them out. That's the right thing to do. We should be pulling them out, right? Then we hear someone else crying, and we say, what are we going to do here? And so we go and we pull them out, and more people start coming out of the river. So we create a really great system of pulling people out of the river. And we've got a little building there now that we can bring people into and warm them up, and places we can put them. And we've got towel distributors and we've got rolls, and we've created a great system of pulling people out of the river. Maybe we even have a little mechanism that grabs them and pulls them out. But as it continues, there are more people coming down the river than it is possible for us to pull out. So we begin throwing in life preservers again, which is important, because though it's not pulling anyone out of the river, at least it's keeping them alive for a little bit longer while they're in the river. So we throw in these life preservers. Now, if we were doing this in dialogue, I'd ask, but what do we need to do next? Well, the answer is we need to go upstream and see what's happening, right? Now, I once did this story with a class of grade 2, 3, and 4s, and I said, what needs to happen next? And one of the kids puts up their hand, and they said, dam the river, which is probably a really great answer, actually. But I'd never heard that before. But basically, we have to figure out what's going on. So we might start asking questions of what's happening upstream. And we might hear stories like, well, people keep jumping in the river because they're really irresponsible. But as we go upstream and we begin to see what's happening upstream, we might realize that actually people are getting pushed in, right? People getting forced closer and closer to the edge of the water, and eventually just being pushed into that stream. And we need to address what's happening upstream that's pushing them in the first place. Well, I think that is a good call for what we need to do. that it is important that in our communities, we begin to, first off, address what people need to survive. We need to make sure that everyone has the right to food. We need to make sure that people have the right to housing. But in our communities where housing is so far out of the realm of possibility for many, we at least need to make sure that there is enough shelter for people to access. We need to make it so that it's not illegal to be homeless. When we pass these laws criminalizing homelessness, making it illegal to be homeless, we are making things so much worse. Instead, we need to look at these criminalizing pieces, this way in which we go about trying to punish people for being homeless. And we need to reverse these and instead say, how do we best support those in our community? How do we create communities where we are actually living together with those who are so often pushed on the outside? I think one of the biggest things we need to do is begin to create communities that are comfortable in awkwardness. So many of our bylaws and the different ways in which we criminalize those experiencing homelessness are because we feel uncomfortable. And we have a hard time discerning between what's uncomfortable and what is actually unsafe. We see someone and they make us uncomfortable, and we don't like that we're uncomfortable, so we say that we're actually unsafe. And so we make laws in the name of safety. And what it really is we are uncomfortable with the presence of the other in our midst. What we need to do, those of us who the system has been built for, is to begin to become embracers of being uncomfortable, of being awkward. We need to be able to live in that awkwardness. We need to be able to say, you do not have to become like us. Because let's be honest, the system we have built is not that awesome. But instead, we need to build places where we are in awkward relationship with those who are different than ourselves and begin to care for each other. One City Peterborough is an organization that's experimenting with different versions of community. We don't always do it well. We don't always do it right. But we do it through a whole bunch of different ways. One of which is we do it through our housing. We create housing that is open to people, but not just housing as it often is. We create communal housing, so where people can come, where people are living together, but they're not just in rooming houses. We're creating community where people are caring for each other in those homes. We want to create programs like employment programs, not because so often we see that people need to get a job because they need to contribute to society. No, but we want to create places where people can build relationships with others. That often that's through having coworkers. We create programs that instead of isolating people who have committed crimes such as sexual violence, we're going to create spaces where people who have committed acts of sexual violence are supported and able to have a group of people around them to help them hold themselves accountable so that they can not reoffend again. We're going to have programs where people can express themselves through art, through music, through various ways. We want to find these ways in which people can build community and do so differently, where we're not demanding of the other, but instead saying we're going to create a community where all of us can flourish, where all of us have a place to be. This is the vision that we're engaging in. And I think this is something that we are incredibly passionate about and that we want to challenge. And so the first step as communities is to challenge those ways in which we continually criminalize others. And the second is to creatively experiment with new ways of being. I'd really love to hear any questions that anyone has and engage with you a little bit.
Okay. I don't see anything in the Q&A itself, so please go and check there. But there's been some active chat in the last little while. I think you touched a few nerves. So one of the things, Catherine Beverly was just making a comment that right on our campus at King's, that we have benches outside of our library that had bars on them, and there. I think it was our social justice and peace class that recognized the issue and petitioned to have them removed, and they were. So sad that they were there is what Catherine was saying, but that they were removed. So I think just that sense of that there's so much going on systemically. And what's really, I think, telling about that, just from your opening, is that it's right across, those benches are right across from a statue of the homeless Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay, it's Jesus on the bench, right? And we forget that reflection, right? Sometimes, yeah. Anna, I'm going to say Facina says, I could never understand why people have to get out of shelters at 9 a.m. and not able to come in until late, that they're homeless all day. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that system. It's just a
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is what we're constantly seeing, is that, so when we ran a shelter, it was literally because we had created a shelter out of basically no funds, and we were only able to rent. We had no space, and we were only able to rent it during the day. But what constantly happens is policies around people having to leave the shelter. And again, why that's usually put into place is that the feeling that if you make shelter too good, it will de-incentivize housing. There's this big, and it's really quite destructive, this way of understanding homelessness, as I had said, which says homelessness is about people making really bad choices. And so we need to de-incentivize that and incentivize making good choices. And so let's make homelessness worse than it already is. Let's make the shelters bad so that people will look for housing. But we know that the reality is that the reason why homelessness is on the increase has nothing to do with people making bad choices, and has everything to do with the fact that our housing, we have very little housing stock in most of our communities. We have very little ways in which people can access, and people can't afford to live in most of our communities. And so access to good quality, safe housing is out of reach for a huge amount of our population. But it is more comfortable for our systems to not recognize that, and instead put the blame on the individual and say, the reason why they're homeless is they're making the choice. So let's make sure they're not comfortable when they're homeless, so that they will make the choice to be housed.
A few questions here in the Q&A now, which is, it's great to see it happen. Keep them coming, folks. So one, I'm going to tackle a small one first, but because I think it talks to what you're just talking about. That Michael asks, how do you feel about basically the possibility of an income guarantee program? So a basic living wage or a living income, I guess. Yeah, if you can comment on that.
I mean, I think guaranteed livable income or basic income guarantee or any of those programs, I think, yeah, we need to begin to experiment with alternatives to the way in which our current social assistance rates in Ontario are not livable by any means. And so we need to begin to experiment with alternatives. And I think guaranteed livable income is a great example. I know that I'm going to blank on the community that it was experimented with in the 80s, I believe, out in the prairies. But one of the pieces that came out of there, which I think is fascinating, is just by doing that in that community during that time, domestic violence rates went down by 35%. That's wild, right? Like that is such a cool example of when you begin to meet people's needs, we begin to address some of the other some of the other issues that are happening. And so I think basic income guarantee is a great idea. But we also at the same time need to be addressing, because I don't know that this will address this, is we need to be addressing the commodification of housing at the same time. As long as housing has become a way in which we can make money, as opposed to the right of individuals and a basic human need, that issue is going to continue to become. Peterborough is unlivable for so many people right now. If I hadn't bought a house prior to this current housing boom, I couldn't afford to live in my own community, right? These sorts of things need to be addressed. And I don't know that we can do basic income guarantee that will address that totally. I think we also need to somehow begin to address the commodification of housing.
Caroline asks the question, to make a shift towards societal acceptance and inclusion of all, there has to be a fundamental shift in the hearts, minds, and actions of individual people. What practical advice would you give for individuals that would assist in contributing to seeing and embracing the humanity in everyone? It's a long question, sorry. I think sometimes people make the mistake of thinking that their own personal efforts won't make a difference and that there are already charities or organizations that are taking care of things. So some practical tips and advice, I think, Caroline.
I think that this is where I do think doing on the ground volunteering is important, because in doing that, we build relationships with people we wouldn't interact with any other way. So I think that's really important. I think that that changes me, and it begins to change. And by getting people engaged in volunteerism, it's the first step. But I think volunteerism, if it stays at volunteerism, is that guilt release valve I was talking about. So I think what we need to match volunteerism with is engaging with the greater issues. Now, often the problem is nonprofits are silenced by their funders at challenging the systems that are creating the issues that require the nonprofit to exist in the first place. And that, I think, and so they have a hard time getting people, so then they aren't able to mobilize their volunteers, if they have volunteers, to begin to engage in the greater systemic issues, because they're not engaging with it, because they're scared of losing funding. And so I think there's two things here. I think in some ways, nonprofits have to be bolder and begin to not be scared of being silenced by their funders, and begin to challenge. But I think they need to be training their volunteers at the same time, so that they're training them on the greater issues and mobilizing their volunteers to engage in changing the systemic issues that cause whatever they're trying to address. So if it's a meal program, it's not, meal programs are needed, right? Like right now, sometimes I think when we talk about the difference between charity and justice, we throw charity under the bus and we say only justice. But the reality is there's a long distance between the just community where everyone has a place to live, or everyone has enough to eat, and where we are now. And so we have to find a way. So people need to eat in the immediate, but we need to be challenging those systems that make it so that people can't eat. And doing both at the same time, I think, is what helps. And so we create programs. Those of us who do programs create programs that both bring in volunteers, but also educate them while we're doing that on the greater systemic issues.
One of the things, Christian, I think, just to say I'm happy with something that King's is doing, and is that we do have a charitable outreach to, we call it hospitality center. It's a soup kitchen type of environment, but what we're doing it a little differently in that we've created it more like a coffee house, which just means that we're coming and joining people in community. We're getting to know people. Mm-hmm. So that sense of personalizing, of taking the anonymity away from, I think is something. Anyway, sorry, that's a little plug for something I think that we're trying to do something right in that. And so it changes the hearts of people who interact. Someone asked the question, how do disabilities intersect with homelessness in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I think it goes, there are so many ways in which, there are a variety of ways in which people who are experiencing homelessness also, I mean, it's a compounding of a whole lot of things. And so I definitely see that individuals with physical disabilities, it is really hard to experience homelessness. But what we also see is, say, what often happens is people are maybe they're experiencing homelessness. They go to the hospital and they're sent home, discharged from the hospital within hours. We've had people who have been discharged with an IV bag, right? We've had people discharged with all kinds of things into nothing. They have nowhere to go, right? And so whereas in a lot of places, if I was sick or experiencing a disability of some kind, I might be able to set up my home in a way that can address that. Our communities aren't set up that way. And so, and most And so many services are not accessible as well.
Okay, just thank you for that. So I'm just so has the expression, so Pauline Willem Bucher asks, has the expression "those who are deprived of a home" ever been used to get away from blaming?
Instead of homelessness.
Instead of homelessness, those who are deprived of a home.
Yeah, I mean, I think there can be all kinds of, and I think our language matters a ton. I think that I try and use the language those experiencing homelessness instead of, and I'm not always perfect at this, instead of those who are homeless, because so it's rather than a labeling of who they are, it is something that they're experiencing in the moment. And also, but the other part is that always in communicating, you want to know what people are talking about. And so you don't want people to get too hung up on what does he mean by those who are deprived of a home instead. And so people know the word homelessness. That's why I still use it. But I hear what you're saying. That's a cool way to think about it.
Right. So Marina makes the point that there are various kinds of housing now happening: tiny houses, secondary suites. I guess it kind of asks the question, I'm embellishing a little bit, but are there kind of alternative ways of living that helps to address the problem, maybe as a...
Yeah, for sure. And I think the experiments that are happening around these various things like secondary suites and tiny homes are really great. I mean, again, often our cities are not, can sometimes be obstacles to those things. So such as tiny homes. Currently in Peterborough, you can't build tiny homes. You can build secondary suites, but it can be quite difficult. But I think it's experimenting with those things, which is what we need to do. One city, what we do, and which is not the only solution, I think there's a whole bunch, but what we do is we became nonprofit property management. So we found that there is a lot of landlords who just felt totally inadequate in being able to house individuals who are coming out of homelessness. They didn't really know what to do. And so we said, okay, why don't we manage your property for you? And you hire us, and we'll make sure your rent's paid. We'll make sure all these things happen. But we are only, if you're hiring us, we're only going to be housing those coming out of homelessness or out of prison. And that was able to increase, because building takes there's so much, it takes so long to build, right? Not that we don't need to, we need to be building, but how do we create stock immediately? And that was one of our ways of doing so, was saying, okay, we're going to create nonprofit property management that allows for current stock to be used that is often out of reach of people who are experiencing homelessness. And that's been that we've found has worked quite well, where we operate as both the landlord and the support services for the individuals in the home.
Okay. So I'm just kind of reading through the chat here. There's nothing in the Q&A right now, folks, if anyone has something burning that they would like to ask. Anna Facina says, having a place or a bed to call your own every day would give the person more responsibility and pride rather than being kicked from one place to another every night. Maybe it's a comment. Was that idea of a regular place to be? I don't know if that's...
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is the thing, is that the more, so we know one of the greatest stressors in people's lives is a move, right? Now imagine your move is daily, right? I know that when I have to do a move, and I haven't had to do one in 15 years, so, but when you work with people who moves, that is a huge stressor. There are individuals who have to move every single day, whether that be out of their shelter bed to a different shelter bed, all those sorts of things. That piece is hugely, that causes a huge amount of stress and mental health anxiety and all those sorts of things. And so the more stable, I think there's two things that often we forget about in the shelter system. Is one is how important stability is. How can we give people a sense of stability? And two is how do we give people some sense of autonomy? When the more shelters become like prisons, the more people act like they're prisoners, right? How can we create spaces where there's some autonomy of their lives while they're living in shelter? So that in order for people to have that kind of comfort to be able to do so, they often need some sort of stability as well.
Um, uh, so I have a couple of things. Anyway, let me deal this one first. So is your organization subsidizing the nonprofit property management endeavor, or if so, or how are you funding this?
Mhm. So we get, yeah, I mean, we're definitely very cheap when someone hires us to do property management. So we fund through a variety of ways. We do have, so we have a halfway house that we operate. So that's a community residential facility for men who are elderly coming out of prison, who are palliative elderly or with mobility issues. That program is sort of a base funding for us because the work we do in homelessness, we don't receive any funding from any government for that. And so because we want to be free to be able to advocate to advocate on behalf of and against the different policies around homelessness. So we fundraise quite a bit. We do get paid a little bit for our property management. We also own some houses, and so that rent helps pay for some of it. And so it's a kind of a hodgepodge of various ways in which our funding is a bit complicated, but that's how we go about it. We don't receive government funding for our nonprofit property management, though. I'll say that.
Okay, I'm going to take a risk here. I'm going to, so Marina Clemens has just asked if she can say something about the tiny homes or give a comment. So I'm just going to make it possible for her to talk for a second. So Marina, if you want to try and just unmute yourself, then you should be able to talk.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for what you're saying. I've been working in this kind of work for close to most of my life in social justice, but I wanted to show you, it's tiny homes in a big city, and it's Reverend Faith Fowler. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. She's in Cass Corridor. And actually, so they have a central area where people can congregate and get support. But when we went there, every house is different because everybody who gets one is able to help build it.
Wow.
They decorate it, and they're all different. And if they have a skill, that's what I found out. And I retired, but I worked, and people have skills, as you well know. And so if they could do carpentry or if they can paint, they help one another. And so that's how their community gets built. And I think when we were there, there was 22 homes and not one of them looked the same. And people, it was amazing. And she's written a book. It's called Tiny Homes in a Big City by Reverend Faith Fowler. You would love it. Absolutely love it if you ever got a chance to go. But the other thing is I was in touch with the Property Brothers, and through BRIC, they've started building tiny homes across Canada for veterans. But each area for veterans, they outside, the person puts a plaque to somebody who died in either Afghanistan or someone they knew. So there's a connection with each other. And again, they're helping each other with either disability or with mental health or whatever it is. So again, they build them, but then they have a common place where they can congregate, play cards, learn some other skills. So it's not just building a tiny house, it's building a community. And I mean, in Windsor, I sit on the housing and homelessness task force, and we finally got it passed that people are able to build tiny houses. Took us 5 years to do secondary suites with our municipality, but we got it through. But tiny houses, these two areas, the one in Detroit is so amazing. We met some wonderful people, and they just, as you say, they feel accepted and they help one another. So it's not a handout, it's a handout to each other. So thank you so much for talking to us. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Marina. Maybe you could put the name of that book in the chat there. So for
Oh, okay, I will, because it's yeah, she talks to anybody that wants to listen to her. She's awesome. I'll
Okay,
put it there. Thank you
Great.
so much.
thank you.
I'll mute myself.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things you said, Marina, that was that really resonates with me is that people want to engage in building their community as well, and so we have a couple of programs. One is our street clean team, where we hire individuals who many are experiencing homelessness or have experienced it in the recent future with significant barriers to traditional employment, to engage in cleaning, and we pay them to do street cleaning of the downtown core. And one of the things that is really cool about that is, again, often they are able to walk the streets when they're doing that, being like, hey, you often see us as being those who are making this place worse, and we're actually making it better. We're cleaning up your garbage that you're throwing out, and it's really cool. And another one is that we, whenever we do renovations, we hire individuals from our community, whether they're engaged in our housing programs or in various ways. We hire them to help with our renovations, to do work. And so we want to be models in how to in utilizing the gifts that are within our community there.
All right. It looks like, I think Rick Heath there, another deacon on board. There we go. Rick was trying to put a link, but it didn't look like it came through. So, oh, there it is. Okay, sorry, it did come through in the chat. That's for the tiny homes part from the Detroit pastor. Okay, thanks. That's an interesting discussion there. If anyone else wants to take a risk and offer a comment online, I might just put you on. So just let's see how it goes. I don't see anything else in the chat. I don't think, unless I missed something.
Someone put their hand up. Oh, it went down again.
I think that was Marina, I believe, that had her hand up. But yeah, you could try with the hand. Sure, that's another way of. There. It's so. I guess I would just say, I'm learning a lot as I'm listening to you, which is great. I always am happy to learn. But I think that what you've opened up for me is a little bit tonight so far is this maybe as we are getting close to concluding, is just that sense of how important it is to create a community. And an understanding to kind of break down those presumptions that are there. I guess, is there, I kind of coming back to Caroline's question a little bit on that note. It's just, are there other suggestions that you could have? A number of people in the chat have talked about how there's similarities between what goes on now in London with things shutting down and ATM shelters being locked and things like this. But so there's a lot of parallels, but things that you might give to people to kind of take away from the lecture, that or resources that might be helpful.
I mean, I think the one core, so I will often get people calling, say, from more suburban parts of Peterborough, who are now for the first time experiencing, say, individuals knocking on their doors, asking for change or those sorts of things, and asking, what do I do in this situation? And I don't have a great answer. My answer usually is, whatever you do, treat them as a human. But the second thing that I would say is that the more we try to eliminate the issues of discomfort that are happening with further restrictions on people who already are very restricted, it will only make things worse. We will only create, and so I think that as much as we can, I think what we need to do is, as a communities, begin to challenge, and usually these are municipal bylaws, so we actually have a lot of power to change these, but they're often passed with very little resistance. So I think what we can do is look to see what are the bylaws that have been passed in our cities that are directly aimed at criminalizing people who are experiencing homelessness, And how do we begin to pull those back? I think that's a starting point, right? It's just how do we, is because these can be passed with so little resistance that's why communities do it. There are bylaws that are passed in communities in Ontario that make it illegal to push a shopping cart down the road. Now, that is only aimed at one group of people, right? Like that is a law that is aimed at people experiencing homelessness. There are rules that make it illegal to sit down on a sidewalk. Some communities in Ontario have rules around that. Again, these are all rules that are particularly aimed at, and the reality is those rules will not make people not homeless, right? We can't punish our way out of homelessness. And so what I think we want to do, when we right now in Peterborough and One City Peterborough are actively involved in challenging the bylaw that makes it illegal to set up tents, not because we think tenting is going to solve the problem. It's not going to. But we know that we can't be a community that both acknowledges housing as a human right and criminalize people experiencing homelessness at the same time. So if we want to take very real steps as communities, and some communities such as London have begun to name publicly that and Peterborough somewhat, but they're not doing a very good job of it, that housing is a human right. If we're naming that, and that is our legal responsibilities as communities in Canada, because we have named housing as a right, the Canadian government has named housing as a fundamental human right. If we're going to do that, then we need to challenge those bylaws and those laws that work against that. And I think that is something, as boring as that sounds, is actually some of the most important work we can do right now, because those bylaws are happening in all our communities and causing huge destruction.
I just want to acknowledge tonight, and I'm sorry, I unfairly gave a number of shout outs to deacons in the house. It's just again, trying to make a connection there. But there are an awful lot of people here tonight who are also connected with the Sisters of St. Joseph, who have done phenomenal work in advocacy and charity, frankly, in our community as well. And but their Office of Systemic Justice does a lot of great advocacy work across the country, and particularly aimed at these issues as well. So a shout out to Sisters of St. Joseph who are here, and a number of people. And I'm sorry, I can't give a shout to everybody, but just to acknowledge that there's an awful lot going on, and people who are here wanting to learn about how to help. So a word of thanks to everyone who's here tonight. So lastly, I would just offer a thing that's a good place to stop and start, if you like, right? To start our way forward, but to stop our lecture for tonight. But a word of thanks to you, Christian, for taking time to share with us your passion, your energy, and your love for the people that you clearly serve. I think that the world needs more people who will take that risk and step up. And I think that the more of us who can learn from that modeling, the better. So I fully anticipate sharing this lecture with a number of other folks. And I mentioned to you earlier that we're recording, for those who are here, that the lecture will be available on our website later for people to access, and hopefully share with people who would want to understand a little bit more of the extent of the problem and some possible solutions. So thank you so much to you for giving of your time and your energy and your knowledge to us this evening.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure being here. So thank you so much.
All right. And a last word of thanks again to those of you who have attended. Thank you for your thoughtful questions, and let's continue to think together and move forward together on this. Next year's Veritas lecture series is starting to take shape. If you have suggestions of speakers that you want to feed to me, I'm very happy for that, but I'm trying to right now I can just tell you roughly that the themes are shaping up around some of what we've just talked about, actually, about listening, about inclusion, and I think we have a few good leads that we're working on right now. One who I've confirmed actually for our Christ the King lecture next year is Father Dan Horan. And I think a number of you will know that name. So very happy for that. Thank you everyone for coming. I wish you, if you were here, I would wish you a safe drive home, but it's not necessary. Be well, stay safe, and let's look together to the day when we can gather in person. Thanks so much for coming. All right, take care, Christian. Yeah. Bye-bye.